So the last group of organelles that we're going to talk about is the semi-autonomous organelles. And these are the mitochondria and the chloroplasts. So there's a lot in this name, semi-autonomous. Autonomy, maybe you know, means self-governing, and semi means just sort of. So semi-autonomous organelles are semi-self-governing. And what is meant by that is that they can divide on their own, so they can make their own decision about whether or not they divide. Everything else that's in the cell can only divide when the rest of the cell divides. But mitochondria and chloroplasts can do that on their own. They have their own genetic material, and this allows them to make some of their own proteins. So they have this ability to do some of their own stuff. However, they will depend on the cell for energy and for raw materials and most of the proteins that are in the cell. So the semi-autonomous nature of mitochondria and chloroplasts is actually really significant for telling us about the history of mitochondria and chloroplasts. So I want to highlight that these features, the semi-autonomy of mitochondria and chloroplasts, has certain features that are similar to bacteria. So I said earlier that they have their own DNA. If you look at the DNA of the mitochondria and chloroplast, called the mitochondrial and chloroplast genomes, they are small and they're circular, and that's actually just like bacterial DNA. I also said earlier that they can reproduce on their own. If you look at how they reproduce in a process called binary fission, and this is the same process that bacteria use to reproduce. So they basically kind of act like little mini bacteria inside of our cells. And so this is important because it tells us about the evolutionary relationship of the bacteria and these organelles. And this is called the endosymbiosis theory. So let me write that out for you here. And it tells us about the origins of mitochondria and chloroplasts. And so what happened billions of years ago is that a purple bacteria, so that's a specific type of bacteria, ended up living inside of a eukaryotic cell. So this is a specialized form of symbiosis, and people have oftentimes heard of symbiosis. This is like the fish that live on the shark, and it eats the stuff off of the shark, so the shark benefits, and then the fish benefits because it's getting food from eating off of the shark. So a symbiotic relationship is a relationship that benefits both partners. Endosymbiosis in this case means a symbiotic relationship that's actually inside of the cell rather than just outside of the organism, like the fish and shark example I just gave. So the bacteria actually colonized the inside of the cell, and the eukaryotic cell and the bacteria had a beneficial relationship to both, so they were willing to sort of keep doing this. Over billions of years of time, this cell lost most of its own genetic material to the nucleus, so it really stopped being totally independent. So you can never take this bacteria and just send it out and have it live on its own. Whoops, sorry about that. You can never have it live on its own. So it's not really a bacteria anymore. It's just evolved from a bacteria and now relies on the cell entirely. The same thing happened in plants. They have both chloroplasts and purple bacteria. So they were colonized by purple bacteria and a cyanobacteria, which is a kind of bacteria that carries out photosynthesis. So the purple bacteria would become the mitochondria in plants, and the cyanobacteria would become the chloroplast in plant cells. So again, I just want to reiterate, the evolutionary history is that they were their own bacteria. Today, they're not bacteria anymore. They're not capable of life on their own. So the mitochondria, we'll just sort of glance at its structure here. We're actually going to devote a whole chapter to what the mitochondria does in chapter 7. And we'll talk a lot more about the structures then, but it has two membranes, an outer and inner membrane, and an inner space called the mitochondrial matrix. The primary role of the mitochondria is to process energy, and this is going to involve producing ATP. So it's going to carry out this process called cellular respiration. And again, this gets its own chapter. It's so important. So it's really an energy processing organelle, and it's going to take sugars and extract the energy from them. And that energy is going to come out in the form of ATP. So that's why we say it's making ATP. So it's going to break down sugars as well as other molecules. So it's going to be responsible for processing fat and anything else we can get energy from. And like I said, we're going to talk about this at great length in Chapter 7. Chloroplasts are part of a larger family called Plastids. So that root plast, Plastids. And these are these specialized plant organelles. An amyloplast is a colorless plastid, and its role is to store starch. So they're present in high concentrations in roots. So a potato is a root vegetable. It's got lots of amyloplasts. Chromoplasts. Chromo is a root that means color. These are structures in the plant that store pigments other than green. So this is where the yellows and oranges come from in things like flowers and fruits. The one we'll focus on this semester is chloroplasts. Chloroplasts contain the green pigment called chlorophyll, so that's where the name comes from. And their job is to carry out photosynthesis for the plant. So the chloroplast, again, is going to get a whole chapter devoted to it, Chapter 8, and this process of photosynthesis where it captures light energy and converts that light energy into sugars. So instead of eating sugars, plants can make sugars. And again, that's really special to plants, and the chloroplast is special to plants. They also have an outer and inner membrane, but then they have a third membrane called the thylakoid membrane, and we'll really get into these structures more in Chapter 8. And so that wraps up the semi-autonomous organelles, and in fact, it wraps up our list of organelles in general. So you need to know the organelles, you need to be able to identify them in a picture, identify their functions, and it's kind of like a laundry list of memorization, so you need to take the time with that memorization.